Thor Love and Thunder is seemingly going to do a lot for the Thor franchise, and probably the Marvel Cinematic Universe as a whole. I mean, it's giving us the return of Jane Foster, which is gonna be extra awesome considering the fact that she is apparently going to be getting in on the action herself. But it could do a lot more as well. As the MCU is known to do, it could very well give us some weird amalgamation adaptation, bringing in elements of different story arcs from across the comics to try to create an all-new story that still manages to feel similar to what comic fans know and love. But what comic storylines could we see get used? And how could they get adapted for the MCU? Well, sit back and relax as I break down a small handful of some of the God of Thunder's comic storylines that we could see come to the MCU, either within Thor 4 itself, or maybe even in a future film down the line. Let's go ahead and dive right into it. Let's start this video off by talking about a pair of stories that we are fairly certain we are going to see at least parts of in Love and Thunder. First up, we have Mighty Thor. The Mighty Thor story arc, of course, tells the story of how Jane Foster picked up Mjolnir and became her own version of Thor. Something that we know is going to happen in the film. But what happened on the page? What happened in the comics that we could see come to the screen? Well, at one point, Thor became unworthy due to some revelations that Nick Fury made to him in secret. Left upon the moon, Mjolnir sat for a time without a proper owner. That is, until Jane Foster was summoned and found worthy to lift it, becoming the new Thor. That sounds pretty great, right? Well, it's not really. See, at the time, Jane Foster was actually undergoing chemotherapy treatment for breast cancer. And every single time that she picked up the hammer and transformed into her godlike form, all of the toxins in her body were purged, including the helpful ones that were put there during her chemo. So she was able to be a full-on superhero, but every single time that she jumped into action, her cancer got worse and worse, which is not really what you want. Now, what could an adaptation of this story within the MCU actually look like? Well, it's hard to say at this point, especially considering so much of it hinges on the use of Mjolnir, which is currently shattered within the Marvel Cinematic Universe, so how Jane Foster will become Lady Thor is kind of up in the air. Perhaps the hammer will be reforged. With the Dwarven forges relit, it is feasible. Though to be honest with you, I don't really see a reason why anyone would go through the trouble of doing that. Presumably the only person that would benefit would be Thor, and since he has Stormbreaker, he doesn't really need Mjolnir. He seems to be doing just fine without it, if not a little bit better. I do have another option that could actually explain it, but I'm gonna save it for a later entry where it actually fits in better. So just sit tight on that one for just a moment. The other comic arc that we know Love and Thunder is going to pull some bits and pieces from is the Godbomb story from the Thor God of Thunder comic series. Now, how do we know that this comic is going to give us at least a little bit of what we're going to get in Love and Thunder? Well, it all comes down to the appearance of the villain from that movie, Gorr the God Butcher. In the comics, Gorr was initially a rather pathetic little creature, desperately trying to scrape by on a world with almost no food available. After his only son died of starvation, he began to believe that there were no gods, which got him exiled by his rather religious people. He wandered the wastes for a while, until he saw a pair of gods fall from the sky and crash in front of him. One of them was Null, a dark elder god who was actually responsible for the creation of the symbiote race. In anger, Gorr picked up Null's blade, all black the Necro Sword, and struck down the god, before taking the sword and setting out into the cosmos, swearing vengeance on all of the gods for not answering his prayers. Fast forward a few millennia to his first encounter with Thor. At the time, the young god was still up and coming. Brash and impatient, Thor attacked Gorr after he slew a god from the Americas, and after quite the bout, he believed he had actually slain Gorr, when in actuality all he had done was take the villain's arm and left him for dead. Over the next few thousand years, Gorr continued his work hunting down gods, until he once again came face to face with Thor, who, alongside two other versions of himself from different points in time, his younger self and an older, All-Father version, helped Thor face him down and thwart his plan to detonate a Godbomb device that was meant to destroy all gods across all timelines all at once. In the process, Thor actually bonded with the Necrosword, which was itself a symbiote of sorts, and bested Gorr, before young Thor went ahead and killed him. Now, I actually have a pretty solid idea of how they could take this story and marry it with Mighty Thor, and it all comes down to the multiverse. As we all know right now, the MCU is going pretty hard on the idea of the multiverse. Pretty much every film has something to do with it, even if we really haven't figured out how yet. So here's what I'm thinking. What if, instead of having Thor team up with versions of himself from different points in his timeline, he instead teams up with Thors from other universes? Admittedly, this might be a tad bit close to No Way Home, which might make it feel sort of redundant, but it worked there, so why not try it here? Of the multiversal Thors, one of them could either be Jane Foster, or maybe a regular Thor will come, bringing an alternate Mjolnir. And then he'll fall at the hands of Gorr, and then the main universe Jane Foster will pick up his hammer and become the new Thor. It could be a solid way to introduce a new Mjolnir to fill the void that needs filling. But this raises the question of who could be the third Thor, since 3 seems to be the magic number here. Well, I've got a pretty good idea for that as well. Pretty much since the very beginning of the Thor film franchise, people have been asking when we might see everyone's favorite horse-faced Corbinite, Beta Ray Bill. And while we did get an Easter egg in the form of a statue in Thor Ragnarok, for some, this isn't nearly enough. And this is where Love and Thunder could come in, since if they need a third Thor, why not use it as an opportunity to introduce a fan favorite character? Finally giving us a cinematic appearance of Beta Ray Bill. In the comics, Bill was one of the last surviving members of the Corbinites, a race of beings whose galaxy was destroyed by Surtur. As he was traveling throughout the cosmos aboard his ship, he ran into Thor, and the two faced off. Surprisingly, Bill was able to disarm the God of Thunder, causing him to revert back to his normal, mortal form. After capturing the now unconscious Thor, Bill attempted to lift Mjolnir and found that he was successful, transforming into a version of the Asgardian superhero. Soon, Bill found himself in combat with Thor once again, however, as the two were pitted against each other by Odin in order to determine who was truly worthy. Once again, Bill came out on top, though he chose to spare Thor's life, as the battlefield which Odin had chosen for their battle put Bill at an advantage that he felt was unfair. After returning Mjolnir to its rightful owner, for his compassion, Odin had another hammer made for Bill, and thus he was able to venture forth as a hero in his own regard, wielding Stormbreaker. Yeah, you heard me right. Stormbreaker was actually his in the comics. Little fun fact for you there. So maybe we could see a Beta Ray Bill from another universe. Maybe one where Thor perished and Bill picked up the hammer to fill in for him, taking up the mantle as the God of Thunder and joining in on the fight against Gorr. Since Gorr presumably aims to use something like the Godbomb to probably destroy all gods across the multiverse, it would be prudent to have gods from other universes step in to help. So why not give us a little bit of the Ballad of Beta Ray Bill and bring him in to help out? Heck, why not? It's not the craziest thing I've ever heard of them doing within the MCU. And maybe use this as an opportunity to bring in Jermaine Clement, who is friends with director Taika Waititi. Having him voice the Corbinite would probably be a pretty good time. From here on out, I'm going to go through a few story arcs from the comics that may have something to do with Thor 4, but could also be something that we could see in a future Thor film instead. So let's go through a few of these Thor stories, or as I'm going to call them, Thories. Get it? Thories? Like Thor stories? No? Okay, you know what? Actually, I'm not going to do that because that's a terrible idea, and we don't like that kind of humor around here. Sorry. First up is Thor Disassembled. This storyline brought Thor face to face with the very concept of Ragnarok. See, Ragnarok in the comics isn't just a one-time event. In fact, there have been many different Ragnaroks, and presumably there will be more in the future as well, which is something that Thor must wrestle with in this storyline, as he is given the opportunity to stop all future Ragnaroks from happening if he allows himself to fall into his eternal slumber. Basically, if he allows himself to die, functionally. As I said, this isn't really something that I imagine we're going to see in Thor Love and Thunder, but keeping this concept of self-sacrifice and eternal slumber around might be a good idea in case actor Chris Hemsworth ever wants to move on from the role for whatever reason. Not that I really see that happening anytime soon, but it's good to have an out just in case. Here's one that we might be building towards, though maybe not in the way that you might be thinking. It would seem that something is going on in the MCU, with Contessa Valentina Allegra de Fontaine going around recruiting people for a new team. Fans seem to think that she's either putting together the Thunderbolts or the Dark Avengers, which, if it is that second one, means that we could eventually get an adaptation of the Siege story arc. In Siege, the Dark Avengers launch an attack upon Asgard, which Thor and a handful of other superheroes had to defend against. Now, this could work within the MCU, as the Asgard that is attacked in the comics is the one that exists on Earth post-Ragnarok. And this could be a cool place to bring back Chris Evans as Captain America if the actor ever decides that he wants to give it another go, as the climax of the Siege arc saw Steve Rogers return after his death at the end of the Civil War arc. It also marked the official end of the Superhero Registration Act in the comics, whose counterpart in the films is the Sokovia Accords, that thing that writers seem to ignore unless it's necessary for the story. So this could be a good opportunity for them to just move past that entirely and get rid of it, therefore removing any questions that fans might have about it in the future in regards to any future superheroing that people might do that would otherwise be kinda sort of illegal under it. So there's a lot that this storyline could do if they decide that that's something that they want to do down the road. Normally, when you make a sequel to something, you usually want to up the stakes. You want to go bigger than what came before. But how does one go about topping the subjugation of Asgard by the goddess of death and subsequent destruction of it by a big flaming fire demon? How about a big f***ing snake? In Mjolnir's song, we got to see what would happen if the Midgard serpent, Jormungand, guarantee I butchered the pronunciation of that by the way, was causing some trouble. So Thor went and faced off with the big guy. Conveniently, the Midgard serpent comes after him right after a curse is placed on him by Hela that weakens his bone structure, making him about as fragile as can possibly be. A wet paper towel, if you were. He's already pretty minuscule in comparison to the massive Midgard serpent, so his chances of defeating the snake seemed like they are very slim. But of course he won, 'cause Thor. Now, you couldn't tell me that seeing the God of Thunder face off against a giant lizard wouldn't at least be awesome to see on the big screen, if nothing else. There are a lot of Thor-based storylines that I could talk about here, if I had more time in this video, that is. War of the Realms could be a fantastic Thor-focused team-up film that could go a long way towards drastically shaking up the status quo of the MCU. King Thor is another that I considered talking about that could have done a lot to help further Thor's personal growth, focusing much more on the trauma that the dude has experienced. But to wrap this video up, I felt it appropriate to talk about Mangog and the death of Mighty Thor. For those of you who don't know what the Mangog is, it is a massive beast that serves as the physical manifestation of the combined hatred of a long-dead race that was wiped out long ago by Odin, probably back during his conquest days. Naturally, this thing is not the biggest fan of Asgardians, and as such has spent much of its existence trying its best to wipe out as many of them as physically possible. And one day, Mangog got dangerously close to taking them all out, as only the intervention of Jane Foster was ultimately able to put the beast down. However, this event occurred at probably the worst possible time. Remember how I said that whenever Jane used the hammer, her cancer was able to run wild? Well, as you can imagine, it was slowly killing her. And it had gotten to the point where doctors informed her that if she transformed even one more time, she would be beyond saving. And that is exactly what happened. Jane became Thor one final time, beat the Mangog, then passed away, her spirit making its way to Valhalla, joining all of the other long-gone Norse heroes. Now, as characters are wont to do within comics, she did eventually come back and actually became Valkyrie, but that's beside the point. If we are going to get Mighty Thor in the MCU, it would make sense to, eventually, have something along the same lines as the death of mighty Thor get adapted for the big screen. Will it happen in Thor 4? I kind of doubt it, but it could be something for down the line. Perhaps if we got a film series focusing on Jane Foster as Thor, this could be a good finale for that. Or it could wind up being a good, gut-wrenching ending to the entire Thor franchise if they ever decided to retire it for whatever reason. Hey there everybody, I'm John Alditz. I made this video and I want to know what you think. Which of these Thor storylines would you like to see adapted to the big screen? Be sure to let me know down in the comments below or go ahead and shoot me a response over on Twitter. I'd love to hear from you. Thanks for watching and be sure to subscribe to CBR for more great videos.